Welcome to episode 60 of the Northern Spin podcast. That's right, after 2.5 years, the Northern Spin podcast is back with a few changes. Northern Spin is a podcast that gives a voice to the North, and my name is Chris Maguire, Executive Editor of BusinessCloud, and I'm delighted to introduce our new co-host, Frank McKenna, Chief Executive and Group Chairman of Downtown in Business. Hello, Frank.
Hi, Chris. Great to be here.
Yeah, regular listeners to the first 5 seasons of the Northern Spin podcast may recall I previously identified as a lowercase c Conservative, but the ineptitude of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, remember her, and the rest mean I now identify as being in the political wilderness. Frank, just tell us a bit about your political story.
Well, a long time ago, about 25 years now, I was an elected politician, a councillor in Lancashire, became deputy leader of Lancashire County Council after 12 years of serving on that authority, was also parliamentary assistant for an MP in West Lancashire, and became leader of the North West Assembly, which at the time was seen as the forerunner to a North West Parliament. But of course that morphed into city regional mayors instead, and that's something we're going to talk about this afternoon, Chris.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that your roots are in the Labour Party.
Very much so. I mean, I was a member of the Labour Party from the age of 15, 16, was inspired really through the Thatcher years, lived in and was brought up in a place called Skelmersdale, a new town, which was very deprived in terms of its economic situation, but had a great upbringing, great mum and dad and all the rest of it, and fortunately was able to go to college, never managed to get to university, but then was able to forge a decent career in politics before establishing Downtown in Business.
Yeah, and well respected across the region as well. So why has the Northern Spin podcast returned? 2 words, Makerfield by-election. That's because by-election is 1 word. If you're asking, a victory for Greater Manchester's Mayor Andy Burnham on June the 18th in the Makerfield by-election will, in all probability, see him handed the keys to 10 Downing Street and replace Prime Minister Keir Starmer. I think it's the most important by-election in my lifetime. From Labour's point of view, I think it's Burnham or bust. Win it, and Labour's most popular politician, according to all the polls, can claim he's got what it takes to beat reform. But a reform victory could add growing momentum to the feeling that Nigel Farage will end up in number 10. Frank, you've known Andy Burnham for 30 years, so you're better placed than anyone to answer this question. How important do you think the Makerfield by-election is to Andy Burnham, to the Labour Party, and to the country as a whole?
I think it's hugely important to all three. As far as Andy Burnham's concerned, in a sense, this is shit or bust, because he's basically put on the line his future political career in a constituency that ordinarily you would say would be a relatively safe Labour seat. But in the current environment, I think, again, fair to say that it's marginal, and it's considered to be a challenging seat for Labour to win. So, OK, Andy goes back to be Greater Manchester Mayor if he doesn't win the seat, but he's a bit of a busted flush.
He's damaged.
He's not going to be able to come back nationally. He's not going to be able to go for a second seat, I wouldn't have thought, in this Parliament. And at the age of 55, his time is now or never, I think. So hugely important for Andy, hugely significant for his future prospects. For the Labour Party, a bit of a crossroads, because they will probably see Andy Burnham, rightly, as their best retail politician. If you look at all the polls, you will see that the most popular Labour politician, in fact, I think the most popular politician at the moment in the country, is Andy Burnham. So they will be looking at this by-election and thinking, well, if Andy Burnham can't beat reform, who can? And that leads you on to your final point of, as far as the country is concerned, how important. Well, I think if Andy Burnham wins, it indicates that reform hasn't necessarily got that juggernaut momentum that takes them automatically and inevitably to government in 3 years' time, and that there are populists on the other side of the political spectrum who can challenge them effectively. If they win it, though, then it would suggest that Nigel Farage will have the keys to number 10 maybe before 2029.
Absolutely. And that's the reason why we've brought the Northern Spin podcast back. Andy Burnham was born on the 7th of January 1970, making him 56. I know that.
56?
56, not 50, 55.
Knocking age off him, you see.
Absolutely. We want to try and get the facts right on this
born
podcast.
on the 17th of January, so I didn't know we were both Capricorns.
Yeah, well, I'm 2 years older than Mr. Burnham. Frank, we're in a unique position that we're both two northern-based politicos. We think, and we've got a unique insight, into Burnham, which I think a lot of the Westminster lobbyist journalists haven't got. So much like Andy Burnham, the fate of the Northern Spin podcast will be determined by the public. If Burnham becomes Prime Minister and you want us to stay, there's a good chance the Northern Spin podcast will remain. If not, then you'll see us in another 2.5 years' time. That's how serious this election, this by-election is. Before we do a deep dive, I just want to give you my take on what I think the situation is at the moment. Andy Burnham's walking the most precarious political tightrope ever. First and foremost, he's got to win Makerfield, which I think will actually be the hardest of the three. So we'll be looking at how he might do that and the challenge presented by reform. At the same time, the King of the North has to win over the Labour membership. And finally, he's got to persuade the country that he's the right man to succeed Keir Starmer. Now, I think most people would prefer him to Keir Starmer. And as you mentioned earlier, Frank, I think the Labour Party don't really have another option. So the key is winning Makerfield. It's the biggest gamble of his career, but the prize couldn't be bigger. Get it right, Burnham's the next Prime Minister. Get it wrong, and Burnham could be joining me in the political wilderness. Frank, what's Burnham's biggest challenge?
Yeah, I think I'd slightly disagree with the inevitability of Andy winning the by-election and then automatically going on to become Prime Minister. And we'll perhaps explore that a little bit during this conversation. But it is going to be a challenge for him to win Makerfield. My prediction, perhaps counterintuitively, is that he'll win it comfortably. I think reform have helped him with the choice of candidate, selection of this character,
Rob Kenyon,
who's, on a daily basis emerges more tweets that he's put out with totally inappropriate, almost prided himself on being sexist. Now, people may say that doesn't matter. I guess it will matter with the females of Makerfield. And also, if you look at the makeup of that constituency, it's quite interesting because you do have pockets of deprivation and pockets of areas which you would describe as very working class. But you also have large swathes, Ashton and Makerfield, for example, awful lot of people you would probably describe as middle class, and they were more likely to vote for Burnham. You've also got that split in the far-right vote between Restore, because Rupert Lowe's party is starting to make a bit of a noise and are being backed by being backed by Elon Musk. Yeah. So he's got deep pockets, that guy. So he'll be pushing them as well. So I think Andy will win, and I think he'll win it comfortably. Now we have predicted these things in the past and been wrong. So let's see. We then go on to Westminster, and I think this is where it starts to get a bit more complicated and complex than people appear to be thinking, because it's a funny old place, Westminster, and it's being caught up in this feverish, almost febrile environment on a daily basis. Keir Starmer being battered from pillar to post, the government not being able to get a break, and ironically, this by-election has given Starmer and his government a bit of breathing space. So all of a sudden, they're doing one or two things, not particularly bold, not particularly radical, but, VAT off some holidays and playgrounds in bloody down south for people to go to, free travel for people, which is all good stuff. And the Starmer bashing, which was incessant for months and months and months, has been replaced by the right-wing media with Burnham bashing. And that's only going to get worse. Yeah. That's going to continue, and it's going to get louder, and the noises and the pressure on Andy Burnham's team is going to become greater. Then, of course, you go to Westminster. What does Andy do? You've got summer recess on the way, quickly followed by the Labour conference. Now, he may try and have a mature conversation with Keir Starmer, which goes something like, Keir, you're a bit of a busted flush. The country just doesn't like you. I think you're a nice guy, but let's try and work out a position whereby I can have a coronation at the Labour Party conference in October in Liverpool. To which Keir Starmer says, bugger off, Andy. I'm the Prime Minister, put up or shut up. Go and get your 81 MPs and let's have a contest.
Which he'll get his 81 MPs.
He'll get his 81 MPs. But does Andy, within a couple of weeks of going into Parliament, really want to say, the first thing that I'm going to do is challenge the Prime Minister? He might do, but that's a brave position to take. And it's also, I think, a little un-Andy Burnham-like. I think far more likely, Andy goes in, is probably offered a big job in the cabinet. I mean, I would just give him devolution. Yeah. I'd just say to Andy Burnham, sort that out. You know, that's your job. We want to use you. We want, as we always say in the Labour Party, our best players on the pitch. And then again, he's got a choice to make. Do I take that job or do I sit on the back benches? If he doesn't take the job, does he look a little bit frit? A little bit of a person who's only there for his own personal ambition. So those issues, not insurmountable, but I think, as I say, more complex than necessarily simply thinking Andy's going to march into Parliament, be carried on the shoulders of all the Labour MPs and marched into 10 Downing Street. And then, and this is the big question that the Labour Party will be asking itself right across the parliamentary party, would we have to have a general election? Because is Andy Burnham simply coming in and replacing a Prime Minister to continue Starmerism, whatever that means, and I'm not quite sure, or does he want a radically different agenda? And if he has a radically different agenda, does he have a mandate to deliver that?
I think there's two things I'd pick up on. I think the first one is I cannot see a situation where he wins Makerfield and doesn't become the next Prime Minister. One of the reasons being that I think he's more electable for the Labour Party than Wes Streeting. I think he's invested everything in the gamble of his life. And I think he's doing it for the top prize as well. So I can't see any situation where that doesn't happen. And I can't see a situation where he sits in the same cabinet as Keir Starmer. I think Keir Starmer is either the Prime Minister or he's yesterday's man. So I think he's going to be the Prime Minister as well. There's a couple of things that I think are interesting. If we talk about Makerfield, and I tend to agree with you, and I whisper it quietly, I think the only way Andy Burnham can't win Makerfield is if everyone thinks he's going to win Makerfield. Yeah. I think that's the danger. And I think the Labour vote has to come out, because I know with the local elections, I don't think they necessarily did. Whereas what Reform are brilliant at doing is galvanising their voter base. If you don't know where Makerfield is, and I know lots of our listeners are from outside the north as well, it's between the M6 and the M61 near Wigan as well. And it spreads quite a long way across as well. Burnham obviously wanted a stand in the Manchester constituency of Gorton and Denton in February, but Keir Starmer and the NEC put pay to that. Now, traditionally, you mentioned earlier, Frank, Makerfield would be regarded as a safe Labour seat, but Reform UK swept the board in May's local elections. However, the sitting MP, Josh Simons, quite ambitious, did the honourable thing and fell on his sword, and here we are. So do you think Burnham's fighting the by-election he wants at the time that he wants against the opponent that he wants in Reform's Robert Kenyon?
I'm not necessarily sure this would be the constituency profile he would have chosen, because, like all politicians, he'll want as safe a seat as possible. But it's the best seat for him, because if he wins it, and as you and I both say we think he will, then it proves positive that he can beat Reform. And they're the main opponents at the moment. They're the people that the Labour Party is absolutely terrified of. If we were in a situation sort of 5-10 years ago where the Conservatives were still the mainstream opposition, Keir Starmer would be getting more time to bed in to see if his policies can eventually break through with the public. But that spectre of Reform is really scaring the horses as far as Labour are concerned. So, as I say, it may not be the constituency he would ideally have chosen, but it's probably the best type of constituency he could have had, because it is losable. So it's not just a shoo-in. I think in terms of the questions to if it's the opponent he wants, well, he'd never have heard of local plumber Rob Kenyon any more than we have. But as I say, with those tweets emerging, I've heard the guy interviewed on the Reform-friendly, I think it may have been their own TikTok account, and he didn't come across as particularly great in terms of charisma or that sort of messaging that you get from people like Farage, and even to a lesser extent generic. So, yeah, probably a decent candidate he's up against as well.
Yeah, I would say that, and for reasons of impartiality, we're here to just give our thoughts. We're not here to side with a particular politician. I think if Robert Kenyon and Andy Burnham wanted to come on the Northern Spin podcast, we'd find room to interview him as well. I think there are a couple of things about reform that I find quite interesting. One is obviously their choice of MP. With the Gorton and Denton by-election, I think they made a big mistake because they parachuted in Matt Goodwin, big high-profile GB News presenter, and they were beaten by Green Party's Hannah Spencer, who's herself a local plumber. There's going to be a big shortage of plumbers in the Northwest fairly soon. I think what they did is they made the right choice in the sense they wanted to go for a local man, a local politician. They obviously went with Robert Kenyon, and I think the problem is that if you go with Robert Kenyon, unless you know what his history is and his social media activities like, then this is always going to come out. And we're recording this on Wednesday, and I haven't heard him be interviewed yet beyond Reform's own PR. Now, I can imagine him being interviewed on Sky News and really being asked some serious searching questions, and how he comes across in that, I think, could have a big sway in terms of what he does in terms of the election as well. And I think, somebody like Carol Vorderman coming out speaking publicly, I don't think her following is necessarily going to decide this election as well, but I think it's damaging. What sort of election do you think Reform have fought so far? Because we're talking about Reform and Labour because obviously they're going to be the two parties that are going to be first and second. No one's mentioned the Conservatives. The Green Party are only mentioned because their candidate withdrew from the race within hours after being announced for the same social media problems as well. What sort of election do you think Reform are fighting so far in Makerfield?
I think they've been put on the back foot because of these tweets. I think they'd have gone after Burnham far harder. It's very personalised, obviously, the campaign against Andy Burnham. But nevertheless, basically they've been having to go on the defensive quite early on because of this character's social media tweets. And I think it's interesting that, they basically looked at the North, looked at Gorton and Denton and thought, what those Northerners like is a plumber. So let's go for that, which seems a bit of a bizarre choice to me. For me, if they'd have been a smart political operation, I don't think they are. I think there's lots of flaws within Reform in terms of its overall infrastructure. And I think, bizarrely, given this sort of anti-establishment profile that they try to sell, they are very Westminster and London-based. So they haven't got a clue about the North. And if they had, and if they'd have been really smart, and this would have given Burnham a bigger problem, select a woman.
Yeah.
Right, that's what I'd have done. I'd have selected a working class woman, but they didn't do that because I don't think they've got the smarts. The other thing that was interesting was to hear an interview, I think it was on BBC 5 Live, with Danny Kruger. Yeah. And Danny Kruger basically said, well, this is the way all Northern blokes speak.
Ex-Tory MP who defected to Reform.
Yeah, just absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
So that's meat and drink to Andy Burnham. Because what Andy Burnham can say, because, listen, Chris, you and I, we're not shrinking violets. No. But some of those tweets make us blush, right? Yeah. And if that was said about our daughter or our wife or our sisters, we will be absolutely outraged. And men in Makerfield will be absolutely outraged. Yeah. So Andy will be playing into that as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that genuinely annoys me when people say they dismiss it as banter in the way men speak.
It's not banter.
I play cricket. I share a changing room with people. I don't hear any of that.
No.
I hear none of it at all. No. So the idea that every man talks like that is for the birds. It really, really annoys me.
But Kruger went a bit further, I felt. I felt as though what Danny Kruger was saying was Northern men talk like this. Yeah. And that is going to piss a lot of people off.
Yeah, no, it's disrespectful. I don't like it, and I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to move it on and say this is just a Westminster bubble story. Yeah. It's not having any cut through as well. I know how I would expect people to vote, but like I say, analysts and politicians pollsters have been proved wrong a lot, too many times actually. So the way we're going to sort of break this conversation down, and we've touched upon it already, really, is that Burnham's got 3 challenges: win Makerfield, win the Labour Party, win over the country. I think where we add the most value is in terms of what we can offer in terms of insight into Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester as well. How do you think Brand Burnham is going? And one of the reasons I asked that for is I don't use Twitter anymore. I took a decision that I didn't like the way Twitter was going, but I've just looked at it recently, and I noticed Andy Burnham's now started a daily update at the end of each day, which I think is a clever move because it bypasses mainstream media. How do you think Brand Burnham's going?
Yeah, I don't think thank you for being compared to Victoria. That's Andy's way. Okay. Listen, I think Andy is obviously a far more media-friendly personality than most other politicians, never mind Keir Starmer. In fact, you would probably say he's only matched by Nigel Farage. Different type of personality, obviously, but nevertheless, they have that retail feel to them, as I said earlier. So I think what I've noticed, and like you, Chris, I don't go on Twitter, but I see things that pop up on other social media accounts. He's far more comfortable in front of a camera. He'll have a conversation about all sorts of things that are outside of politics that younger people, or just ordinary people for that matter, like to talk about, like to engage in. I'll give you a quick example. He done a great thing that was posted on the North West Labour Party site where he just went through his playlist. Yeah. Now, that's just human. And he's very comfortable talking about that because, as you know, he genuinely loves music.
He does, yeah.
Similar to when you talk about football. Now, every MP's got a favourite football team, right? Andy Burnham is fanatical about Everton.
As are you.
But it's not made up.
Yeah.
It's not, I better pick a team, so I'll say, like famously David Cameron thought West Ham were Aston Villa when he said he supported Aston Villa. So, Andy Burnham is genuinely authentic in terms of his football following, his backing of Everton Football Club. So he can talk about footy and he can have a conversation about culture generally, whether it be football, whether it be sport, whether it be music, whether it be concerts, you name it. And I think that plays better into a by-election, a constituency fight such as this, because there is an awful lot of spotlight on you as a person. It's not just about the party badge. And whereas if you had somebody who was a little bit staid, a little bit stiff, a little bit, dare I say it, run by the machine, as I think Labour's candidate in Gorton was, then it might not necessarily play well. Whereas Burnham has just been able to break out of that and say, you're voting for me. And the final thing I'll say, Chris, be interesting to get what you think of this, because you're a much more better marketeer than I am. The Andy for us, he's one of us, and I think that really works.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I watched his election campaign launched and the sun was out, and that would have dismissed a few stereotypes about the North. And I looked at that placard, Andy Burnham for us, and actually it's Andy Burnham : for us. Yeah. But actually that plays very well to Makerfield, plays very well to the Labour Party, and it plays very, very well to the country as well. So whichever way you want to slice and dice that, I thought that was quite clever as well. Like you, he was wearing a white T-shirt. Well, I'm not sure it suited him, but so there's that image of Andy Burnham, relaxed in front of the camera, white shirt, not having a shirt and tie. And this is what I do think, right? And to misquote the rapper Eminem, can the real Andy Burnham please stand up? Because I think if the real Andy Burnham please stands up, that we see, the Andy Burnham that is comfortable in front of the camera, will he use the Christian names of the journalists, or whoever it is, who asks him? When he gets asked a question from the member of public, he'll say, what's your name? That is Andy Burnham. Now, the thing is, a lot of that's being drowned out by some of the press, who've obviously got it in for him as well. When you boil it down, Andy Burnham's unusual in politics because he's likeable. If you've ever walked with Andy Burnham through the streets of Manchester, people generally come up to him and say positive things, whereas a lot of politicians, you would need a bodyguard. Nigel Farage being one, for example. He is everything that Keir Starmer isn't, from the perception of being a great communicator. And I saw an article from Joshie Herman in the Mill, and he described him as being an instinctive politician, which I think was a really, really good description as well. I looked at his launch video on X, and it's had 2.7 million impressions, which I know it's just statistics, and statistics can be anything. But it's called Politics Isn't Working for a Place Like Ours. And I listened to a podcast called The News Agents with Emily Maitlis and John Sopel, who are pretty outspoken. And he said it was nice to hear an authentic Labour politician because they haven't heard one for 2.5 years, even longer if you think about the run-up to the last election as well. I think, that's classic Andy Burnham. And I think the King of the North works very well by definition in the North. I think where I would have a slight concern about Brand Burnham and Andy Burnham in particular is that he's getting a level of scrutiny that he's not had in 10 years. In fact, longer. And, the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, every story is being painted as a negative as well. And I think he's just got to rise above that. And I think if he, and I'll talk about an example later on in the episode, if he descends and he drops his guard and he's not the Andy Burnham that we know, then I think he'll be demonised. I don't know if that's a fair comparison, but that's how I take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read this morning that there's been 38 attack pieces by the Daily Telegraph on Andy Burnham since he was selected as Labour's candidate for Makerfield. It's absolutely
Is that because they're scared?
Incredible. I think so. I think they recognise that here is, a serious politician that would offer a much greater opposition to reform than Keir Starmer currently does. So, yeah, I think there's an element of fear there. I think that the point you make about Andy maintaining his authenticity where Labour government ministers have failed to do so, because I know a lot of them, as you know, Chris, and they could come in and have this chat comfortably with us as long as it was off the record. As soon as you start recording it, they turn into robots. And I don't know where that comes from. I saw it happen with Neil Kinnock from 87 to 92, where basically so-called spin doctors got hold of him and just took every ounce of personality out of the guy. And he became this robotic, mechanical politician that just didn't engage or associate with anybody, which wasn't the Neil Kinnock that was elected as Labour Party back in 1983. So I think Andy's been fortunate in that he's been out of that world long enough so he can be seen as well as an outsider and an insurgent. And I think that may help him in any subsequent contest for the leadership of the Labour Party, because people are looking for an outsider to come in and clean things up. So I think that will help. I think going back to the point in terms of Brand Burnham, his video, and whether or not his attitude, his approach to all this negativity is going to be able to withstand the pressure. I think he's got to shed King of the North quickly. Because he wants to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, not Prime Minister of the North of England. And although the North of England is going to be important in terms of the next general election, so too is Scotland, so too is Wales, so too is the Midlands, so too is South of England. So he's got to shed that and shed it quite quickly and basically turn that into a positive to say, well, okay, that was then, this is now. And actually, what I want to do for the country, and he's sort of saying this, isn't he, in terms of his narrative, is what we've been able to achieve in Manchester. So he's got to try and shed that King of the North badge as quickly as he possibly can.
I would agree with that. And everyone knows I'm a massive cricket fan. And when Brendan McCullum became the coach of England, somebody coined the phrase Bazball because his team scores at a quicker rate than anybody else, and they believe that if they score at 5 and over instead of 3, they get more time to bowl the opposition out. Now, they went on a big winning run, and everyone hailed Bazball as fantastic. The moment Bazball started to lose, and we got beat by the Australians, we got beat by the Indians, everyone said Bazball as a criticism. Now, as Andy Burnham is the King of the North, in the North is seen as a positive. If things start to turn, and we're talking about him being Prime Minister, then, and he announces stuff which is pro-North, I think people will say, oh, he's a King of the North. So I think you're right. And actually, it depends who you believe, but I've interviewed him countless times. He's never used the term King of the North, but he accepts that people use it about him. And I think he's not unhappy with the phrase, but I definitely think he'll want to jettison that association. What I thought I want to do with the Northern Spin podcast is provide insight. And as a journalist of some 35 years, I think I probably can, because we talk about the Daily Telegraph, we talk about the Daily Mail and the fact that they've got it in for Andy Burnham. But I just thought I'd try to explain how that comes across. And I'll use an example that I know very well. So there's a journalist who works at the Daily Mail called Christian Calgi, right? Full disclosure, I've known his parents for 30 years. We used to work at the same paper. I got on with him really well. Christian was literally destined to be in politics. He loves politics. And he's worked across the piece. Now he's working for the Daily Mail as a senior political correspondent at large. He's a fantastic speaker, a great writer as well. Now, he was invited by Reform to follow Nigel Farage and Rob Kenyon around Makerfield. And he wrote this piece. He described Rob Kenyon's being linked to Makerfield for 200 years. So you can see the slant on that particular story. Now, in Christian Calgay's own words, and I get on with Christian, Nigel Farage made the, quote, spontaneous decision to pop into a local cafe for refreshment. Now, some people might think that couldn't possibly be the case. It then emerged that a certain Andy Burnham was sitting just metres away from Nigel Farage in this cafe, and there was this gazebo next door. So, Christian Calgay, being the journalist that he was, saw the opportunity to front up to Andy Burnham. This can only go one way, right? Because you know where the Daily Mail are coming from. So Calgay approaches Burnham, and the subsequent Daily Mail headline is Burnham's tirade of fury. Now, I've interviewed Andy Burnham, and I'll admit, I did work at the Daily Mail once upon a time, but I've never seen the words tirade and fury used in the same sentence as Andy Burnham. Burnham was clearly unhappy because he was there talking to young adults with additional needs when he was doorstepped by Christian Calgay as well. Now, subsequently, the owner of the cafe, somebody called Gemma Crompton, wrote a letter complaining about the Reform UK and about the entourage that they brought into this cafe. Calgay then does a 12-minute interview on the political and gossip website, Guido Fawkes, and a whole new audience get a completely distorted impression of Andy Burnham that we both know. So this is going to be, I can't think of a more ill-tempered, by-election than anything else I can remember, simply because there's so much at stake as well. But I think that episode with Christian Calgay says two things to Andy Burnham. The first thing is that actually he's entitled to challenge you because you want to be the next Prime Minister of this country. So, suck it up. You're going to have to. But the second thing I think you should tell Andy Burnham is actually don't take it personally. Because if you take it personally, then I think the problem is people who don't know you will form an opinion. And social media is a horrible way of perpetuating a perception of somebody. That's my take on it. So do you think this is going to be an even more dirty campaign? Or dirty is not the right word, but bad-tempered, than it already is?
I think it'd be probably both, dirty and bad-tempered. As I say, I think Reform are going to try and throw the kitchen sink. In fact, Farage used the phrase, didn't he, as Andy Burnham. It will be aided and abetted by the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the mainstream media. I haven't even looked at GB News. I'm sure they're having a field day as well. I think in this particular instance, as I understand it, this was supposed to be a private event. That Andy had been told, no press, we don't want you using it as a platform. It's a group that he's supported for many years in Greater Manchester, and it was a pre-arranged appointment. So I think he was right to be angry. I think his better option would have been to simply say to the journalist in that situation, look, not the time or place. If you want to meet me down the road in half an hour, give you an interview. Now, that usually is the Andy Burnham you and I have come to know and will be the more natural reaction. But again, it comes back to this thing I said about Kinney. All of a sudden, you're in this bubble. All of a sudden, you've got the fight of your life. And it's not just the prize of becoming the MP for Makerfield, it's potentially the prize to become Prime Minister, a lifelong ambition. He's had to go being the Labour Party twice before. So he is under pressure. He's got to start, as you rightly say, Chris, to appreciate that there's more people out there from the right-wing press who are both interested and determined to do him in than has ever been the case before. And you totally spot on in terms of your advice. You can't take it personally. In fact, you've got to treat it as a compliment. You should be seeing these attacks as a compliment to him, because if he was a no-more politician, if he was a politician who was just an empty vessel, who was going to come into 10 Downing Street and continue the government's journey into the abyss, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, would be cheerleaders from the side. They'd be saying, sooner we get Andy in, the better. Sooner we can get rid of Starmer and get Andy Burnham in number 10, the better. Instead, they're attacking him because they know he's going to be a much better offer to the British electorate than Keir Starmer is.
If you're listening, Andy Burnham, this advice is free. Do you think Burnham's Manchesterism and his track record as Greater Manchester Mayor will be big enough to offset the general loathing of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party at the moment in Makerfield?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think it's overplayed anyway, that the loathing of the Labour brand. I think Keir Starmer has had a terrible 2 years. I think some of this is over the top criticism. Yeah. I don't think I can't imagine why Keir Starmer is a more unpopular Prime Minister than a fella who was locking us all down and throwing parties. Yeah, I just can't get my head around that. Yeah. But again, I think it plays into the intensity of the press hatred of Starmer and the attacks that he's had to endure. So it will, just simply by changing personality, give the Labour brand a boost. And actually Labour's poll numbers, though low at 20%, are still better than Keir Starmer's personal numbers. And actually, and flipping the coin, Kenny Badenoch is more popular than her party. Yeah. What you've got with Starmer, he's more unpopular than Labour. So although he's inheriting a government in trouble potentially if he becomes Prime Minister, Andy, he's inheriting a Labour Party brand that is maybe on life support, but is certainly capable of being revived.
Yeah, I listened. I listened to an interview from Tony Blair after I listened to the interview rather than read a 6,000 word essay. But he came out today and he made a few comments. But he said, if we get a new prime minister, that's 7 prime ministers in 10 years. He said you can't be a serious country if you've got that sort of track record. That number was brought down because of Liz Truss's short stint and in the top. I just want to ask you a quick question about reform. Now, what I want to do with the Northern Spin podcast is, to be apolitical, to report the news. I have a real issue with newspapers and TV stations that try to get you to think like they want you to think. That's not what journalists are here to do. But I look at Nigel Farage and I look at the Reform Party, and obviously he's got his platform at GB News to get his message across. He doesn't want to talk about his £5 million gift from crypto billionaire Christopher Harborne, which me personally, I find absolutely disgusting. I think it takes politics somewhere where it should never go. And every decision, Nigel Farage makes as regards to cryptocurrency is tainted by this 5 million. Facts, you can't dispute that as well. You've got Rob Kenyon, who is making every day there's more headlines about him. Carol Vorderman, he's just the tip of the iceberg in the sense that some of the other stuff he's saying about football referees, drivers, teenage mums, etc., etc. This is horrible. This is horrible. And obviously we're not going to know until June the 18th, but is any of it landing? Because like you said earlier, like Richard Tice and everybody in the Reform Party just try and dismiss it off as this is fake news. This is the Westminster bubble. And I think, am I unusual in being disgusted at this £5 million gift and the fact that Nigel Farage doesn't want to speak about it? Is any of it landing?
I think what they've adopted is a Trumpian approach to scrutiny, and they hope that this is going to work in the UK as effectively as it has in the US. I'm not sure it will. And I think there is evidence that it's starting to cut through some of these more critical reports of the activities of not just Farage, but Tice and his tax dealings. You've also had the former chairman saying that he took donations and gifts from other people in the run-up to the general election. So I think there's more to come as far as this is concerned. And the poll numbers for Reform seem to have plateaued at about 25%. They were at 35 at one point. So although they had great local election results, and it'd be churlish not to recognise and acknowledge that, the fact is that they appear, as I say, to have hit a bit of a ceiling at 25%. And I think that is at least partially to do with some of the exposés on both the activities of the high-profile people within Reform, such as Tice, such as Farage. But also I think what's starting to cut through is the fact that the less you see of Farage and the more you see of people like Danny Kruger, who I mentioned earlier, Jenrick, the woman who's named Poachin from Runcorn, the less likeable they are. Yeah. I mean, these are odd characters, right? And a lot of them are former Conservatives. And Kruger and Jenrick in particular, were in a government responsible for many of the things that Reform are criticising. And I think that's starting to cut through with the electorate.
If you had to have a boat, and you had to have this, actually, boat's quite topical given the whole debate over the small boats.
Yeah.
If you had to have a boat of unpleasant, odious characters, I think Suella Braverman, I think Robert Jenrick, I think Jenkins. I think
she's a good singer, though.
She is a very good singer, but I think these would be the sorts of people you wouldn't want to share a boat with, and yet they're all sitting in the Reform Party as well, which adds to the feeling that actually Reform is like the Conservative rejects. I don't think they've lost a really good MP, the Conservatives, except I think Danny Kruger had his,
Yeah, I think Kruger, for me, demonstrated what I've always suspected, which is there's not much under the surface. He looks good, he comes across as being, but as soon again as he was put under pressure over those tweets, the easiest thing for Kruger to do, which is what you and I would have done, just automatically as an instinctive human being, never mind politician, is saying, yeah, outrageous, those tweets. They were in the past. He's apologised for them. Can we please move on? He tried to defend them and then tried to deflect it as to banter amongst northern men.
Yeah, no.
Outrageous. And I think a smart politician doesn't do that, you see, Chris.
No, as I say, agree with you 1,000%, to quote Rio Ferdinand. That's all for this part of the Northern Spin podcast. We'll be back after a short interval. Welcome back to the Northern Spin podcast with myself, Chris Maguire, and Frank McKenna, the podcast that we won't let a crypto billionaire sponsor. We looked at how Andy Burnham wins Makerfield in part one. The question is, how does he win over Labour and how does he win over the UK as well? You said earlier in part one, you don't think it's as simple as Burnham winning Makerfield and automatically being coronation taking place to become the next Prime Minister. What do you think about, do you think there's a chance that if Andy Burnham does win Makerfield and he does become the PM, do you think there's going to be growing pressure on him to hold an early general election?
Potentially. It very much depends on what narrative he uses to become Prime Minister in a leadership contest, if there is a contest. So there's several scenarios, isn't there? The first one, and people who don't follow politics must look at that Westminster chaos and circus with dismay at times, because you mentioned 7 prime ministers in 10 years or whatever it is, but the Labour Party is very different to the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party can change a leader done and dusted within a week, because it's only the members of Parliament who actually have a vote initially, and they usually sort it out between themselves. I know Truss and Sunak went against that because basically they decided they wanted to have a contest. Look at the mess that ended up in. Labour's a much more complex being, because what you've got there is the Parliamentary Labour Party, then you've got the members, and then you've got things called affiliate organisations, which include trade unions, co-ops, Fabian societies, all sorts of other odds and sods that pay money to be affiliated to the Labour Party. They get a vote in the leadership contest as well. Now, ideally, what would happen is that Keir Starmer would have that conversation that I referenced earlier and said to Andy, obviously I recognise, mate, the game's up. But, I did save the Labour Party from total destruction after a disastrous election defeat in 2019. I've led us to a general election victory. I want to go out with some dignity. So can we map out a timetable that suits you and suits me as well? And that might be this Labour Party conference in October. He may go longer. Starmer may say to Burnham, look, for the sake of the party, for the sake of you, it does look a little bit counterintuitive for you to be in Parliament for 2 minutes and then to become Prime Minister. Why don't we give it a bit longer? There's dangers in that for Andy Burnham, clearly, because other people emerge, other candidates start to campaign. The idea of Andy not being challenged, I think, is at the moment difficult to imagine, given that Wes Streeting, amongst others, have indicated that they would run in any Labour Party contest. I suspect that Wes Streeting has the numbers of parliamentarians, but in a members' vote, polls demonstrate that Andy will win it comfortably. Can an accommodation be brought whereby those 3 principal players, Starmer, Burnham and Streeting come to an accommodation which enables Andy Burnham to come PM almost seamlessly in a transition, Wes Streeting to take a place back in the cabinet, and let's play fantasy politics a little bit more and say, Keir, you've done a great job on the international stage. Do you want to be my Foreign Secretary?
Much the same way as David Cameron was brought back. I actually think you've given me some food for thought there, because actually the thing I don't think Andy Burnham would want would be a coronation. Yeah, because I think he has to be seen to be, and I think the Labour Party have to be seen to be democratic, even though it's very hard to get rid of a serving leader. And I think there has to be some sort of climax, and then he can say, I've got a mandate of sorts, even if it's not from the country. I think if he does that, then I think it probably kicks the can down the road for an early general election, which I'm not sure he would want. I want to talk to you about Joshi Herman's article. So for those who don't know, he's the founder and the editor of The Mill. He's a journalist. He wrote a piece about Andy Burnham, which attracted a lot of attention. I read it. I thought it was interesting, actually. I thought parts of it were a bit harsh, but there were two bits that caught, and parts of it were very fair. There were two bits that caught my attention. The first was this quote, okay. There are broadly two stories being told. In one telling, he's the saviour Labour needs, a man with radical analysis of what ails the country and a playbook for change that has been forged and perfected in Manchester. In another, he's a cynical chameleon, a master communicator who lacks substance and will say anything to advance his career. So, Frank, is Andy Burnham the saviour of the Labour Party or a career-obsessed, cynical chameleon?
I'm not sure he's either. Andy Burnham can't single-handedly save the Labour Party. The Labour Party, whether it's under the leadership of Andy Burnham, Keir Starmer or anybody else, has some tough decisions to face up to over the next 3 years, not least welfare reform. So Andy Burnham becoming leader doesn't change the difficulties and the challenges that the Labour Party and the government faces. Is he a chameleon? Well, here's the charge. Basically, Andy Burnham is saying different things now than he did 10 years ago, 20 years ago and 30 years ago. Guess what? So am I. Yeah. When I first entered politics, I believed in unilateral nuclear disarmament. I campaigned for the Labour Party in 1983 when they were against being in the European Union, or the EEC as it was back then. What else was I against then? All sorts of different things. If Andy Burnham was a bit of a joke of a politician, he'd be preaching the same stuff as he was 30, 40 years ago. It's a strength that Andy's been able to evolve his views and his opinions, because life is different now to when it was when he came into Parliament in the early 2000s. So I don't think he's a chameleon at all. Is he somebody who intuitively can identify what engages with the public, what the public are actually thinking? Absolutely. But equally, is he somebody that can persuade, can convince, can lead people into positions that perhaps they hadn't believed previously? I think absolutely he is. What Josh is describing, to me, is a good politician.
Yeah, I interviewed Andy Burnham after the 2024 general election, landslide victory. And honestly, he'd just come back from 10 Downing Street. He'd gone away with the other mayors. I think even Ben Houchin from Teesside was there, Conservative mayor. And he came back and he said he was really energised. Now, Andy Burnham might be a brilliant actor. He's a politician at the end of the day. His job is to convince me to think certain things. But I got the impression then that he was really up for it. And he really felt that there was a Labour government which he really wanted, and they were putting devolution on the front foot. And one of the first things that Keir Starmer did is to bring these mayors together down to 10 Downing Street. Andy Burnham would not be standing in his by-election if things were going well for Keir Starmer and Labour.
Sure.
Right. So is he an opportunist? No, I don't think, because if things were going well, it's like a football manager. Nobody looks to get rid of the manager. I think what he can see is that Labour's chance is disappearing quicker than Everton's chances of getting in the getting into Europe, and the season's just finished. And I think that not scares him. I think that really, really frustrates him. So I think he's put his name in the hat simply because if he doesn't, that'll be it for him. And if he loses and he enters political wilderness, I think he'll look back on that and say, you regret the things that you don't do. You don't regret the things that you do. So I don't think he's an opportunist as well.
Just one thing on that, Chris. Don't underestimate the number of people who've been approaching Andy Burnham and saying, you've got to run. You've got to find a way back into Parliament. Because, as I mentioned, there's this huge fear within the Labour Party of reform. If it was the Conservatives There's two things. That firstly, I think there'd be more patience, as I said, with Labour members, Labour parliamentarians, in terms of let's see if we get it right. But there is this sort of psyche of Buggins' turn. Well, OK, if the Tories come back for 5 years, then we've got another chance 5 years later. But the idea of a reform, populist right-wing government, is really scaring Labour MPs. And that's why many of them, and Labour Party members and supporters, have been going to Andy Burnham saying, you've got to come back to Parliament, because they're genuinely worried about a reform government.
Well, they know that they won't win their next general election. There was something else Josh Herman said in the article, and it caught my eye. It referred to how Manchester's track record on social values was built on capitalism, which is something I think both of us, have spoken about before. Now, this is what Joshy wrote. The dirty work that Manchester's revival was built on, striking hard deals to get capital flowing into the city, sometimes giving away public land and holding your nose about who you were giving it to, didn't energise the new mayor. And there's a quote from a former colleague of Andy Burnham which says, Andy has always been interested in the people side of the economy, but he's never shown much interest in the harder infrastructure and investment side. So, Frank, how does Burnham square his principles with political pragmatism?
Again, I would say to Josh, you play the hand you dealt. Now, why would Andy Burnham come into that role as Greater Manchester Mayor and say to Richard Leese and Howard Bernstein, as it was at the time, what I want to do is park my tanks on your lawn because you're managing the economy so well. I want to basically get in the middle of that and start to mess it up. He's inherited a great economy. He's inherited a regenerated Manchester. Andy Burnham will be the first one to say he credits Richard Leese, Howard Bernstein and others with success.
Every time.
So, but if Andy would have come in then and started to put his size nines into that particular agenda, then I think he could have been critical. Josh could have been saying, and what Andy Burnham tried to do was take credit for everything Howard and Richard and others had achieved. What he did was he saw the inheritance that he had and he saw where he could add value. And where he added value was in that social side of policy, which Manchester, by its own admission, I'm talking about city councillors, I'm talking about Richard and Howard and Bev Craig and Joanne Roney, who followed Howard. It was the fact that we built this big shiny city, but people in the city and the wider city region hadn't necessarily benefited. Andy Burnham recognised that that was the agenda he needed to take forward. He also recognised that the power as a mayor is quite soft, and so he needed to become the champion for Manchester, Brand Manchester, and the wider region, city region. And I think in that, he's done an exceptional job to the point where he is now the most recognised mayor in the country, bar none. And I include Sadiq Khan in that.
Yeah. I found myself agreeing with you, about all of that. And I think, I look back over an interview that I did with him when he spoke at our Northern Leaders event. And the first thing he said, because Sir Howard Bernstein's family were there, the Northern Leaders was inspired by Sir Howard Bernstein, the former Chief Executive of Manchester City Council. And I think the first 3 minutes of a 6-minute speech were devoted to Sir Howard Bernstein. So it's not like he's trying to take the credit. I think Burnham's got two choices if he does become Prime Minister, though. I think his first one is he reluctantly sticks to Labour's original manifesto, but he won't do the things he wants to do because he wants to change. And I think the second thing is he comes up with these ambitious plans and he rips at the manifesto, but to do that, he has to call a general election so he can say he's got a mandate from the public. I think he's either going to have to hold his nose because it won't be the manifesto that Labour signed off on and the public signed off on, or he goes and he calls an early-ish general election. You think he'd get a bounce and that he might call a general election, but not imminently.
It's a tightrope for him, and he will well remember the Gordon Brown experience because Andy was in Gordon Brown's government, and of course Gordon Brown had the opportunity of calling a relatively early general election, which by all accounts people think he'd have won, albeit probably a squeaky bum time. I think it'd have been close, but I think he would have won. He called off that election, delayed for a further 2 years. Then, of course, the financial crash happened, and then Gordon Brown lost the election to David Cameron. So Andy will have that in his mind. In terms of the manifesto that, as I say, he'd inherit as Prime Minister, then he puts himself in a bit of a straitjacket. However, there is probably enough flexibility with it whereby he would think, I can deliver this with a bit more excitement, a bit more oomph, and certainly with a better narrative and sales pitch than Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have managed. And he needs to get people around him as well, Chris, who can help him with that, because it can't all be about Andy Burnham.
I think Andy Burnham needs to win hearts and minds outside of the North, which is the reason why he'll bin off the King of the North if he becomes the Prime Minister. I think I've got this principle that actually, will somebody like a particular person? Will I like you? Will you like me? Will the public like Andy Burnham? Many years ago, I interviewed George Osborne before he became the Chancellor. It was when Labour was last in power. That's how long it was ago. And I interviewed him twice in the space of 2 months. And I interviewed him first in Cheshire, and then a couple of months later, he came to Chorley, where I was the editor of the Chorley Guardian. Famously, the previous week, Peppa Pig had been in Market Walk Shopping Centre, and there'd been crowds of people to see Peppa Pig. There was no one to see George Osborne, nobody at all. And he walked up the stairs, and he was with his aide, and his aide said, "You met Chris 2 months ago in Cheshire," like that. And my reporter was behind him and heard everything. So as he gets to the top of the stairs at the Chorley Guardian, George Osborne walks in, he says, "Chris, how are you?" Like that, like we were best friends. Yeah. And I thought, my God, that man's got a good memory. The point is, George Osborne isn't somebody that, I'm not saying he's not a nice guy, but he's not somebody I think you warm to because he comes across as a bit false. Andy Burnham, you put him in a room with people who he doesn't know, I think most people would like him. If they want to form an opinion because of what he did or what he said 23 years ago, they will form it anyway. Yeah. You came up with an idea, which I thought was spot on, actually. You think if he did become the Prime Minister, he should hold regular press conferences, set the agenda, bypass, that section of the media who clearly have got it in for him as well, whether it's every day, whether it's twice a week. But you think that's what he should do? I think daily. I think he should do a daily half-hour press conference in the morning. Limited time for questions, therefore, obviously, but he enables the government himself to set the agenda rather than having to react to news stories that are breaking in the Daily Mail every day, or the Daily Telegraph, or GB News, whatever it might be. Trump does this brilliantly. Flood the zone. Get your story out there. If the press don't want to touch it and don't want to talk about it, well, that's fine, because you've got social media to continue to get your messages. But it's very difficult for the press to ignore a Prime Minister's statement. Now, it doesn't have to be Andy Burnham on the podium every day. Donald Trump's not on that press podium every day. But Boris Johnson, the idea he came up with, which never really quite caught on, was to appoint a press secretary who did those regular press conferences. Do it daily. Burnham's brilliant at it. And I know, one of the things he is absolutely expert at is answering questions. Yeah. And it can be on anything. He'll always be able to pick an answer out on something. He's not necessarily a master of everything, but he knows enough about stuff to be able to give an answer. You mentioned Donald Trump, right? And I don't think I'm giving anything away when I say I'm not his biggest fan. Okay. But in terms of Truth Social, how many people have heard of Truth Social before Donald Trump posted on it? And how many journalists write a story and they say, writing on Truth Social. Now, he grabs the news agenda. And if he throws you a story that you don't run with, he'll throw you another one. Yeah. And it could be just a throwaway line, where we're not concerned about X, Y, and Z. So I actually think he could manage the agenda. I'm going to paint a story for you, right? Okay, this is a story. And this sounds a bit like, La La Land, right? Okay, hospital waiting lists are down. Okay, net immigration is down. The 5p stamp duty rise has been put on hold until the end of the year. Inflation is down. They are positive stories, but the thing is, they're all true. Yeah. They're all true stories under a Labour government that just don't land. No one's interested in them. And the problem is that Labour, under Keir Starmer, have got a horrendous problem with communications. And they keep thinking, we'll change the communication department and it'll change the narrative. It won't change the narrative. They can't get their news stories out there because stories like Peter Mandelson and Keir Starmer's judgment are always going to be called into question, which is the reason why Keir Starmer, is a dead man walking from the perspective of a prime minister. And like you, I think some of the abuse that he's had is disgusting. It is disgusting. I've just come back from Singapore, right? In Singapore, they pay their politicians a lot of money. I mean, I think the prime minister there is on like 2 million Singapore dollars, which is probably £1 million. They target talented people, kids at the age of 8 and 9, to be politicians. And they pay them money so they haven't got to get second and third jobs. I would advocate that in the UK. Pay our politicians more to get the best, and then get rid of the ones who really don't deserve to be politicians as well. Communication's Burnham's strengths, but he has got to have something positive to say. We're going to go to another break in a minute, but before we do, Frank, one of Burnham's biggest achievements as mayor has been the B Network. I'm not sure if he becomes Prime Minister, he'll have time to nationalise the rail or the bus network. Clearly, he's going to need some quick wins. What are those quick wins going to be?
Well, I think, first of all, he turns the rather dour office of Prime Minister into something that's a bit more lively, a bit more exciting. And let's not underestimate that in the days of 24/7 news. So I think that's a big plus for him as Prime Minister, for the Labour Party and the government. Secondly, I think there's things that he needs to get a grip of quickly that are going in an okay direction. But let's take planning reform, for example. We want to build 1.5 million houses in this Parliament. Now, I think that target is unlikely to be hit. However, we can get somewhere near it if we can get that planning legislation through. I think he needs to say something early that is very private sector friendly, a bit counterintuitive for what people are expecting from Andy Burnham, something that says to business, we want growth, and here's one of the ways we're going to do it. We're going to get those planning reforms through. We're going to start building. I think that would be a massive win for him. On the social side, because he'll be massively interested in this, he knows how devolution can be effective. He knows where it works. He knows where its faults are. He needs to get a grip of the Treasury and say, if we're going to have pilot projects for fiscal devolution in Birmingham and Manchester, let's do it seriously, and let's start to look at the skills and training agenda. It's something he knows about, it's something he's passionate about, and I think he wants a wider reform of the education system. Again, I think that plays well into the wider population, because I think more and more people are starting to second guess now our educationalists, our teachers, our schools, to say, are our kids actually being prepared for the future? Who's talking about AI in any of the political debates other than Tony Blair? So he needs to start to get a grip of that agenda as well. But a quick win for me would be some business, private sector friendly announcements that are within that manifesto, which back his economic growth and the government's economic growth mission, and can, as I say, maybe give people who are a bit sceptical of Andy Burnham a reason to hang their hat on a bit more.
You just made me think about, obviously, Andy Burnham and the baccalaureate is something he's passionate about, because he believes university isn't for everyone. So vocational training is the way to go, because it evens up the playing field. What you say in terms of making a pro-business announcement, I think actually makes a lot of sense, because anyone in Greater Manchester who knows Andy Burnham will know he's pro-business.
Yes.
But the way it's written by the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail is that he's anti-business in a Jeremy Corbyn type way, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So I think that would be a very, very good move as well. And I also think devolution is something that he'll lean heavily on. If there's one thing that Andy Burnham said over the last 3 or 4 years, I think he would take back in a heartbeat. I think it was the interview when he was with the New Statesman, when he said the government was in hock to the bond markets. And I think because we all remember Liz Truss's disastrous prime ministership and the way she tried to ride roughshod over the financial regulations, I think that lingers back in everyone's mind. And I think Andy Burnham just got to win hearts and minds. And actually, because people have got a perception of Labour sometimes and the way they've mishandled the economy in the past. And I think that's something he would have to focus on very, very quickly and send that message to the bond markets. I'm an adopted northerner, right? I've canvassed the views of some of my friends down south, and actually I was surprised at how sceptical they were of Andy Burnham. Can I just say their scepticism of Andy Burnham was nothing compared to their scepticism of Angela Rayner. You know, and I was surprised. Now the thing is, not a big sample size. I absolutely get that as well. I think Andy Burnham needs to do is focus, put a big emphasis on Gen Z, right? Because Gen Z are incredibly vocal, and Gen Z spend a lot of time on social media. I listened to a survey today actually on the rest of politics, with Campbell and Rory Stewart, Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, and they had somebody on talking about some surveys they've done of Gen Z voters. And what came back was that the three politicians that are most recognisable in this order, Andy Burnham, Zach Polanski, the Green Party leader, and Nigel Farage. Now, no great surprise that the three of them are the best communicators, and the three of them are actually quite proficient on social media as well. Now, I would look at Andy Burnham's TikTok account, and I'd say that's a work in progress. But I look at the way New York Mayor Zoran Madami, the way he galvanised Gen Z, the way he won, the New York mayoral race against all the odds, and he wasn't afraid to laugh at himself. And there was a quote that he came up with. He was being interviewed, and he said, a lot of people have said that my age means that I should be precluded from winning the mayoral race in New York. They've said at 33 I'm too young to be the mayor. He said, I promise you that's going to change, because Saturday I'll be 34. Yeah. Now, everyone laughed at that. Gen Z laughed at that. And I talked to my girls who are in their 20s, and they are digital natives as well. And they're currently voting, or they talk a lot about green. That comes from looking at Polanski's videos on TikTok, I would imagine. So I think when he comes into power, if he does all the things you've said, and he really, doubles down on being authentic, but also playing to Gen Z, I think he's got a real chance. And on that note, we're going to go for another break before our final part of the Northern Spin. So welcome back to the part 3 of the Northern Spin podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, look out for our special episode on the life and times of Andrew Murray Burnham. This next section is called On Manoeuvres. Now, normally we speculate on who's jockeying for position, but it's pretty clear. Everyone's on manoeuvres at the moment, so let me throw some names at you, Frank. Do you think Wes Streeting's Brexit play, when he brought up Europe, was a deliberate ploy to smoke out Burnham's stance on Europe?
Yes, I think so. I mean, Wes and I are quite close in political terms. We've met on a regular basis, and
have you got him on speed dial?
I think yes, his views are pretty well, as much as I have Andy Burnham. Neither of them ever answer me call, but I do phone them occasionally. I think it was. I think what it did though was, indicate, as you mentioned earlier, the need for Labour to have a conversation about its vision, its ideas for the future. And, Europe is something that at some point we're going to have to grapple with in terms of what our relationship is with them. Because certainly due to the Trump presidency, we are looking more and more isolated, whether that be security-wise, whether it be on the economy in terms of tariffs and that sort of thing. So to a point, it was to smoke Andy Burnham out. But on a serious note, I think Wes Streeting is a Europhile, and I think he recognises that whichever government is in power, unless and until we can get that much closer alignment with our European trading partners, then economically we're going to struggle. 100 billion quid a year it's costing the economy. Now, you're not going to plug that gap with a trade deal with Papua New Guinea, for fuck's sake. Yeah. So I think he was raising an issue that had 2 points to it. One, a serious point in terms of the future of the country and the need to have that conversation in a mature fashion about what our relationship with the European Union is going to be. But of course, there will have been an element of him looking to a future leadership contest because he knows the Labour membership are very much pro-Euro.
I think you touched on it earlier in the pod that Labour politicians are walking around with straitjackets on. They can't say anything. They're really interesting when the camera's not on them, but they go out in front of a camera and they become real dullards, don't they?
Yeah. I think you would be it would be difficult to aim that criticism at Streeting.
100%.
And I think what Wes has proved is that every time you veer outside of that very tight regime of communication, you get slapped down. Oh, he's on manoeuvres. He's sort of trying to challenge leadership. I was in Wes's company that week, sometime late last year, when there was a big blow up about Wes Streeting's going to challenge Starmer for leadership. And I was sat with him at an event, and he was dumbfounded by that, because he didn't have any intention of challenging Keir Starmer for the leadership at that point. He was desperate for Starmer's government to start getting credit for some of the things that he was involved in, like the NHS waiting list reduction, as you've referenced. And he's big mates of Rachel Reeves. So the idea that at that point he was on manoeuvres, but I think what that did for Wes was, first of all, constrained him in a sense, because he was then going on to, and the next few media interviews he did, if you know him like I do, you recognise there was a change. He was being far less forthright. He was sounding a bit more robotic, doing himself, and more importantly, doing the government no favours. And I think it also probably said to him, you can't win with this guy. You've got to challenge him at some point. Yeah, I think so.
I think so. I think two things I'd say about Wes Streeting. I'd say that sometimes you can't win, whatever you do. So people criticise his association, quote unquote, with Peter Mandelson.
Yeah.
So what does he do? He publishes all his WhatsApp messages and every correspondence with him. And then people say, hey, he's doing this to challenge Keir Starmer and distance himself from this. And other people say, well, he must be associated with Peter Mandelson, otherwise he wouldn't be doing it. So he's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't. Yeah. I know people in the NHS who say that he was the best health secretary they've known, because what he did is he absolutely held everyone to account, held their feet to the fire, and there's still a long way to go with the NHS, but it was moving in the right direction. So, but that's maybe not going to convince the Labour membership. Okay, who else is on manoeuvres? So, Angela Rayner, whose long-running case with HMRC over unpaid stamp duty has conveniently been settled whilst all this has been going on. Okay, do you think she's on manoeuvres?
To a lesser extent. I think Angela Rayner has always been reluctant to go for the top job. And I think partly that is for personal reasons and the family scrutiny.
She's got a disabled son, isn't she?
Yeah, and she wouldn't enjoy. I mean, nobody enjoys that. But I think Angela, and I think there is I think sadly there is still more pressure on female politicians than there are on male politicians, and so she's aware of that more than most, because she's had all this treatment as deputy leader of the Labour Party, never mind since she became deputy prime minister, and compare and contrast the treatment she got over this tax evasion allegation in comparison to Tice and subsequently Farage and this 5 million gift. So
you mentioned that, actually, and I would agree with that. And one of the examples I would give is that I saw a story in a tabloid, not popular in Liverpool, and it was a picture of Angela Rayner with a boyfriend, Tarry, the former MP, and he's there in his budgie smugglers, and she's there pretty covered up, and it would have been about 33 degrees. Now she knows if she goes down there in a bikini,
for sure,
then she's going to be front and centre of all the media, and she gets that level of scrutiny that a male politician like Tarry, former politician, wouldn't get. 100% agree with that.
Yeah. So I doubt whether she'd want the job. I think it would be fair to say that if Andy Burnham doesn't win Makerfield, doesn't get back into Parliament, and Wes Streeting has already indicated he's going to challenge for the leadership of the party, would she leave the field open to Wes Streeting for a free run? No. Absolutely not, because obviously she's got different political views. I think she's probably got slightly different political views to Andy Burnham as well, although she will be naturally closer to him, and they've got the Manchester connection as well, of course. But my money will be on Angela Rayner getting behind Andy Burnham rather than running for the position herself.
Yeah, agree with that. And a bit of a left field one to finish with. If Burnham wins Makerfield, there's going to be a very hotly contested mayoral election for Greater Manchester. So Labour's got to put up a big name candidate. So I was thinking, who could that candidate be? And you get the usual suspects. Gary Neville, who said he'll never do it. I can't see him having the time to do it. Then I thought Josh Simons wouldn't do it because he probably wouldn't be high profile enough. No. And if it was a shoe-in, he might do it, but it's a coronation, but it's not going to be. So then you get somebody like Bev Craig, Councillor Bev Craig, the very highly rated leader of Manchester City Council as well. So you're seeing a few stories and a few people. Have you got any sort of idea who would potentially throw their hat into the ring to that?
It's not going to be Gary Neville. Gary and I had a conversation about this years ago. And I did tell him that the job wasn't simply about cutting ribbons and making speeches and television appearances. You know, a wet and windy Wednesday night in Cheetham Hill, talking to Labour Party members who are giving you an ear bashing. Don't think that's Gary Neville's style.
Most of them about football.
Yeah, most of them about, probably. Well, would the City fans vote for Gary Neville? That's an interesting question. I think... Sat here today, I would say Bev Craig would be favourite if she wanted it. But it's a very different job to the one she's got. She's probably got more power on a day-to-day basis than Andy Burnham, would you believe, because the City Council is responsible for delivering lots of stuff. A lot of Andy's power comes on strategic issues, and he can put plans in place, but then he's relying on others often to deliver, whereas Bev can pull all the levers at the City Council level.
Yeah, she was a person that I thought of, but also the level of scrutiny she would get, especially when Reform pits a high-profile candidate against it, I'm not sure she'd want. So one final question before we conclude this episode of the Northern Spin podcast. You're well versed with the the movements within the Labour Party. So if you were doing a comparison between Andy Burnham, Keir Starmer, and Wes Streeting, what would it be? Strengths and weaknesses, and who would you go out for a drink with?
Oh, well, politically, and Andy won't thank me for saying this, there isn't a massive amount between them.
Between him and Starmer, or between the three of them?
Between the three.
Yeah.
Right. So, as I say, Andy won't thank me for saying that, but I think that's the truth. Is he slightly to the left of Wes and Keith? Well, of Wes, possibly, yes. But it's more about emphasis, I think, than actual policy delivery. In terms of the strengths, well, both Andy Burnham and Wes Streeting, as we've discussed, are charismatic politicians, easy in the company of people. Andy is more experienced and so probably a little bit easier in front of the camera and has that advantage of being the insurgent and the outsider at the moment, which will play well with the wider British public. And his name recognition is greater than Wes's, which is incredible for a regional politician over a national politician. So strengths-wise, I think Andy probably just has a few more ticks in the box. Wes Streeting, as I say, very talented politician, done a good job at health, will, I think, be an increasingly important member of a future Labour government. I don't think he'll be Prime Minister yet, but I wouldn't rule him out for that position in the future, Labour leader, Labour Prime Minister, because he's got all of the attributes to go on and do that. Keir, a good man, in the job for the right reasons. You know, you think again about the stick he got for taking a few suits and free specs when Farage is being gifted £5 million. He's just dull in terms of his personality in front of the camera. When you meet him on a one-to-one basis, he's not that much more exciting. He's a nice guy. He's pleasant. He'll have a nice chat to you about Arsenal, but he's not as animated as Andy is about Everton. And I just think that he's a manager. He's a process-driven politician. And in 2026, unfortunately, that's not what the British public want.
If the Labour Party was a business, then Keir Starmer would be the chief operating officer to make sure everything's working and to make sure you never run out of pens. But he's not going to be the chief executive. No. Really enjoyed that, Frank. Hopefully the listenership and the viewing public as well on YouTube have enjoyed it as well. That's all for this episode of the Northern Spin podcast, the first one since the end of 2023. If you've enjoyed it, tell your friends and family, give us a 5-star review. Do look out for our Andy Burnham special. Massive thank you to my co-host, Frank McKenna. And as always, my name is Chris Maguire.